I stood there watching Sheriff Karen lock the gate that trapped me on my own ranch. The same gate I had installed 20 years ago. The same fence she had built to destroy me. But what she did not know was that I now owned the only key to that lock. Her smug smile faded as I pulled out the deed to the property she thought belonged to the county. The look on her face when she realized her own trap had become her prison. That was the moment I knew justice would finally be served. 20 years. That is how long I had called this ranch home. Every morning I woke up to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the soft whistle of wind through the oak trees that lined my property. This was not just land to me. This was freedom. I had built this place from nothing. When I first bought these 40 acres, there was nothing but scrub, brush, and dreams. Now there were sturdy fences, a barn that housed 12 horses, and pastures where my cattle grazed peacefully. Every board, every post, every mile of fence line represented years of sweat and determination. The ranch sat at the end of County Road 47, about 15 miles outside of Millbrook. It was quiet out here, peaceful, the kind of place where you could think clearly and live on your own terms. My nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and that was exactly how I liked it. I had one access road that connected my property to the county road. It wound through a small valley and crossed a creek before opening up to my main gate. That road was my lifeline to the outside world. Without it, I was completely cut off. The town of Millbrook had always been quiet too. We had maybe 3,000 people, most of them families who had lived there for generations. Crime was almost non-existent. We had one bank, one grocery store, and a sheriff's department that rarely had much to do besides issue speeding tickets and break up the occasional bar fight. That all changed when Sheriff Karen was elected 6 months ago. She had run on a platform of restoring law and order to our county. Her campaign signs were everywhere, promising to crack down on crime and hold troublemakers accountable. She spoke at town halls about bringing modern policing techniques to rural communities. At the time, I thought she was probably harmless. Most of us did. We figured she would settle in, realize how quiet things were, and spend her time doing paperwork and attending community events like the sheriff's before her. I should have paid more attention to the whispers. People talked about how she had been forced out of her last job in the city, how she had been investigated for excessive force complaints, how she seemed to have a particular grudge against property owners who lived outside town limits. But I was focused on my ranch, on my cattle, on the simple rhythm of rural life that had brought me so much peace for 2 decades. I thought my property, my gates, and my privacy were protected by law. I was wrong. I will never forget the morning of March 15th. I woke up at dawn like always, made my coffee, and walked out to check on the cattle in the south pasture. That was when I heard it. The sound of construction, heavy equipment, voices shouting orders. My heart started racing as I walked toward my access road. What I saw there defied belief. A massive chain-link fence, at least 8 feet tall, stretched across the road. It blocked my only way in or out of the property. Men in orange safety vests were installing a heavy metal gate right in the middle of my access road. 2 sheriff's deputies stood nearby, watching the work with their arms crossed. I recognized one of them as Deputy Martinez, who had always seemed like a decent guy. The other was new, someone I had never seen before. "What the hell is going on here?" I called out as I approached them. Deputy Martinez looked uncomfortable. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. "Sir, we have an order from Sheriff Karen. There is a property dispute regarding this access road. The fence is being installed for safety reasons while the matter is resolved." I stared at him in disbelief. Property dispute. This is my land. I have lived here for 20 years. I have the deed. The new deputy stepped forward. His name tag read Brookshire. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of aggressive posture that suggested he was eager to prove himself. "Sir, you need to calm down. The sheriff has determined that this road crosses county property without proper easement rights." "That is impossible," I said. My voice was getting louder, but I tried to control myself. "I have surveyed this property 3 times. The road is entirely on my land." Deputy Brookshire's hand moved to his baton. "Sir, if you continue to be disruptive, I will have to ask you to leave the area." Leave the area. I could not believe what I was hearing. "This is my property." Deputy Martinez looked even more uncomfortable. "Look, Mr. Henderson, I know this seems wrong, but we have our orders. You need to contact the county courthouse and work this out through proper channels." I watched in horror as the construction crew finished installing the gate. They attached a heavy padlock and handed the key to Deputy Brookshire. Just like that, I was trapped on my own land. "How am I supposed to get to town?" I asked. "I need to buy feed for my cattle. I need groceries. I have a life outside this property." Deputy Brookshire shrugged. "That is not our problem. You should have thought about that before you built on disputed land." The casual cruelty in his voice made my blood boil, but I could see that arguing would get me nowhere. These men were just following orders. The real problem was Sheriff Karen. As the deputies and construction crew packed up their equipment, I stood alone by the locked gate. For the first time in 20 years, I could not leave my own property. I was a prisoner on land that I owned, trapped by a fence that had no legal right to exist. I walked back to my house in a daze. This had to be some kind of mistake, a bureaucratic error that could be straightened out with a few phone calls, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Sheriff Karen had targeted me specifically. The question was why. The next morning I called every lawyer in Millbrook, all 3 of them. The first one, Jim Patterson, had handled my property purchases years ago. His secretary told me he was unavailable and would call me back. He never did. The second lawyer, Rebecca Torres, at least took my call. She listened to my story with growing concern. "This does not sound legal," she said. "But Karen Martinez has been very aggressive since taking office. She has been citing obscure county ordinances that nobody has used in decades." "Can you help me?" I asked. There was a long pause. "I am sorry, but I cannot take this case. I have too much business with the county to risk making enemies." The third lawyer would not even speak to me directly. His paralegal called me back and said they were not accepting new clients at this time. I drove my ATV to the fence and climbed over it, leaving the vehicle behind. I needed to get to the courthouse and figure out what legal authority Sheriff Karen thought she had. The county courthouse was a tired brick building that had been built in the 1960s. Inside, the clerk seemed to expect me. The property records clerk, a woman named Susan who had always been helpful in the past, avoided eye contact. "I need to see any recent filings regarding my property," I told her. She handed me a stack of papers without saying a word. As I read through them, my anger grew. Sheriff Karen had filed a complaint claiming that my access road crossed county land without proper permits. She cited a survey from 1952 that supposedly showed the road in dispute. The problem was, that survey was completely different from every survey that had been done since then. It showed boundaries that made no sense and measurements that did not match the actual geography. But it had been officially filed, and that gave Sheriff Karen the legal cover she needed. I spent the next 3 days going from office to office, trying to find someone who would listen. The county commissioner was in meetings. The mayor referred me back to the sheriff's department. The state attorney's office said it was a local matter. Everywhere I went, I got the same message. Sheriff Karen was operating within her authority. If I did not like it, I could file an appeal and wait for a hearing. The next available hearing date was 6 months away. Meanwhile, I was still trapped on my property. I had to climb over the fence every time I needed supplies. My cattle were running low on feed. My truck was parked on the county road because I could not drive it to my house. That is when I started hearing from my neighbors. The Johnsons, who lived about 5 miles away, told me they had been forced to sell their land after Sheriff Karen cited them for zoning violations that had never been enforced before. The Rodriguezes had their barn condemned after a surprise inspection, found minor code violations. She is trying to drive out all the old property owners, Mrs. Johnson told me. Her brother-in-law is a real estate developer. He has been buying up land for half its value after Karen makes life impossible for the owners. That was when I realized this was not random harassment. It was a systematic campaign to force rural property owners to sell their land below market value. Sheriff Karen was using her badge and her authority to enrich her family at our expense. The legal system had failed me. The politicians had failed me. If I was going to fight back, I would have to do it on my own. I cleared my dining room table and spread out every document I could find. Property deeds, survey maps, tax records, and newspaper clippings about Sheriff Karen's election. If the system would not help me, I would have to build my own case. The first thing I discovered was that Sheriff Karen had been busy since taking office. Over the past 6 months, she had forced the sale of 12 rural properties using various legal pretexts: zoning violations, tax disputes, environmental concerns, and property line disagreements. Each time, the land was purchased by Millbrook Development Company at significantly below market value. Millbrook Development Company was owned by Richard Martinez. Sheriff Karen's maiden name was Martinez. It did not take a detective to connect those dots. I drove to the county records office every day for 2 weeks. I made copies of every property transfer, every citation, every legal filing connected to these forced sales. A pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Sheriff Karen would find some legal justification to harass property owners. She would make their lives miserable with constant visits, citations, and threats. Eventually, they would give up and sell to her brother-in-law at a fraction of what their land was worth. The fake survey she had used against me was just one tool in her arsenal. She had also used obsolete environmental regulations, forgotten zoning laws, and creative interpretations of county ordinances. Each case was different, but the result was always the same. I started reaching out to the other victims. Most of them were afraid to talk. The Johnsons had moved 2 counties away and wanted to forget the whole experience. The Rodriguezes were facing criminal charges for interfering with a police investigation after they protested too loudly. But a few people were willing to share their stories. Tom Bradley, whose farm had been seized for unpaid taxes that he had actually paid, met me at a diner 30 miles from Millbrook. "She is untouchable," he told me. "I tried to fight her in court. My lawyer got threatening phone calls. My wife's car was vandalized. Finally, we just took the money and left." "What about the state police?" I asked, "or the FBI?" Tom shook his head. "Karen has connections everywhere. Her husband works for the state attorney's office. Her cousin is a state trooper, and she is careful to stay within the letter of the law even when she is breaking its spirit. That night, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the locked gate that trapped me on my own property. I felt defeated. Sheriff Karen had built a perfect system of legal extortion, and there seemed to be no way to stop her. But then I remembered something Tom had said. She is careful to stay within the letter of the law. I pulled out the survey maps and studied them more carefully. Sheriff Karen claimed that my access road crossed county property. But if that was true, then the county owned the land where the gate was installed. And if the county owned that land, then there had to be a deed or title somewhere that proved it. I spent the next week researching property records for every piece of land within a mile of my ranch. What I found changed everything. The small strip of land where Sheriff Karen had installed her gate was not owned by the county. It was privately owned by a family trust that had been inactive for 30 years. The current trustee was an elderly woman named Margaret Foster who lived in a nursing home 200 miles away. Sheriff Karen had built her fence on private property without permission. She had committed trespassing and property damage. But more importantly, whoever owned that strip of land controlled access to the gate. If I could buy that property, I could lock Sheriff Karen out of her own trap. Margaret Foster was 92 years old and sharp as a tack. When I called her at the nursing home, she listened to my story with growing outrage. "That sheriff built a fence on my family's land without permission," she asked. "Well, I never. That is trespassing pure and simple." "Mrs. Foster, would you be willing to sell me that property?" I asked. "It is only about an acre, but it includes all the land around that gate." She was quiet for a long moment. "Young man, my family has owned that land for 60 years. We never did anything with it because it is just a strip along the road. But if some corrupt sheriff thinks she can steal it, she has another thing coming. So you will sell it to me." "I will give it to you," she said, "on one condition: you use it to make that woman pay for what she has done." I drove 3 hours to meet Mrs. Foster in person. She was tiny but fierce, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had already prepared the paperwork to transfer the deed. "My grandson is a lawyer in Dallas," she told me. "He says this whole situation is illegal. That sheriff has no right to block access to your property even if she owned the land, which she does not." The deed transfer was surprisingly simple. Mrs. Foster signed the papers. I paid the filing fees, and within a week I was the legal owner of the acre that controlled access to Sheriff Karen's gate. But I needed more than just ownership. I needed the key to the lock. That took more planning. I contacted a locksmith in the next county and explained my situation. He was sympathetic and agreed to help. On a Tuesday afternoon, when I knew the deputies were usually in town, he met me at the gate. "This is definitely your property," he said after checking the deed. "You have every right to change this lock." It took him 20 minutes to replace Sheriff Karen's padlock with a new one. He handed me both keys and smiled. "I hope you make that sheriff eat crow," he said. I spent the next week preparing for what would come next. I installed security cameras around the gate and on my property. I made copies of all my legal documents and stored them in multiple locations. I contacted a lawyer in the state capitol who specialized in civil rights cases. Most importantly, I called the local newspaper and several television stations. I explained the situation and invited them to be present when I confronted Sheriff Karen. At first, they were skeptical, but when I showed them the documentation of her pattern of abuse, they became very interested. "This could be a big story," the reporter from Channel 7 told me. "Police corruption in small towns always gets attention, Can you guarantee that something newsworthy will happen? I guarantee it, I told her. On Friday morning, I positioned myself near the gate with my phone ready to record. I had tipped off Sheriff Karen's office that there was a disturbance at my property. I knew she would come personally. She always did when she wanted to intimidate someone. She arrived at exactly 10:30 a.m. with two deputies. They drove right up to the gate, expecting to unlock it and drive onto my property as they had done many times before. But the lock would not open. I watched from behind a tree as Deputy Brookshire tried the key repeatedly. He looked confused and frustrated. Sheriff Karen got out of the patrol car and tried the key herself. "What is wrong with this lock?" she demanded. That was my cue. I stepped out from behind the tree with my phone recording. "The lock works fine," I called out. "You just do not have the right key anymore." Sheriff Karen's face went through several expressions. Confusion, then recognition, then rage. "You cannot change this lock," she said. "This is county property." I held up the deed that Mrs. Foster had signed. "Actually, Sheriff Karen, this is my property. You built your fence on private land without permission. That makes you a trespasser." Sheriff Karen's face turned red as she realized what had happened. She stomped toward the fence, her hand on her weapon. "You think you are clever," she shouted. "I will have you arrested for interfering with a police investigation." "What investigation?" I asked, still recording. "The one where you illegally blocked access to my property using a fake survey." Deputy Martinez looked uncomfortable. He had clearly not known about the questionable legal foundation of the fence. Deputy Brookshire, however, was reaching for his handcuffs. "Sir, you need to open this gate immediately, or you will be charged with obstruction of justice." I pulled out my phone and called 911. "Yes, I need to report trespassing on my property. There are 3 armed individuals threatening me on land that I legally own." The dispatcher was confused. "Sir, are you talking about police officers?" "I am talking about people who claim to be police officers, but are trespassing on private property," I said loud enough for Sheriff Karen to hear. She was furious now. "You cannot call 911 on us. We are the police." "You are trespassers," I replied calmly. "And according to Texas law, I have the right to defend my property." That got her attention. She knew as well as I did that property rights are taken seriously in Texas. Even police officers cannot simply ignore property boundaries without proper legal authority. The news crews started arriving at 11:00 a.m. Channel 7, Channel 12, and a reporter from the Austin newspaper. I had given them all the same tip: corrupt sheriff to be confronted at rural property dispute. When Sheriff Karen saw the cameras, her demeanor changed completely. The aggressive posturing disappeared, replaced by nervous attempts to control the narrative. "This is an ongoing legal matter," she told the reporters. "I cannot comment on the details." But I could comment, and I did. I showed the reporters the deed proving I owned the land where the fence was built. I showed them the fake survey Sheriff Karen had used to justify blocking my access road. I explained how she had been systematically targeting rural property owners to force them to sell to her brother-in-law. "Sheriff Karen has been using her badge to enrich her family," I told the cameras. "She trapped me on my own property for 3 months, but her own illegal fence has now become her prison." The reporters started asking Sheriff Karen hard questions. Why had she built a fence on private property? Why had she used a 60-year-old survey that contradicted all recent property records? How many other landowners had been targeted in similar schemes? She refused to answer and ordered her deputies back to their patrol car, but they could not leave. The gate was locked, and I had the only key. "Open that gate right now," Sheriff Karen demanded. "I will be happy to," I said, "as soon as you remove the illegal fence you built on my property." We had reached a stalemate. Sheriff Karen was trapped by her own trap. The irony was perfect, and the news cameras captured every moment. The situation grew more absurd as the afternoon wore on. More police units arrived, but they could not get through the locked gate either. A county supervisor showed up and tried to order me to open the gate, but he had no legal authority to do so since I owned the property. By evening, the story was spreading on social media. Videos of Sheriff Karen trapped behind her own fence went viral. The hashtag HOA Karen trapped started trending locally. The legal pressure was building too. My civil rights lawyer arrived from Austin and immediately started documenting violations of my constitutional rights. The state attorney's office sent an investigator to review the situation. Sheriff Karen finally realized she had made a terrible mistake, but by then, it was too late to fix it quietly. The story exploded across social media overnight. Videos of Sheriff Karen trapped behind her own fence were shared thousands of times. Local news stations picked up the story, then regional outlets, and finally national media. "Texas sheriff trapped by her own illegal fence" became a national headline. Cable news shows used it as an example of small-town corruption and abuse of power. The story had everything viewers loved: a clear villain, an underdog victim, and poetic justice. But the real impact was local. Other victims of Sheriff Karen's scheme started coming forward publicly. Tom Bradley drove back from 2 counties away to tell his story to reporters. The Rodriguezes held a press conference detailing how they had been harassed and threatened. A pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Over her 6 months in office, Sheriff Karen had targeted 15 rural property owners. All of them had been forced to sell their land below market value to Millbrook Development Company. The total value of the scam was over $2 million. The Texas Rangers arrived on Wednesday to begin a formal investigation. They interviewed me for 3 hours, recording every detail of how Sheriff Karen had blocked my access road and used fraudulent documents to justify it. "This is one of the clearest cases of corruption we have seen," Ranger Captain Williams told me. "She used her badge to commit what amounts to armed robbery." The county commissioners called an emergency meeting. The room was packed with angry citizens who had been following the story. Many of them were rural property owners who now understood they had been targeted in a systematic scheme. Sheriff Karen tried to defend herself. She claimed she had been enforcing legitimate county ordinances and that any mistakes were unintentional. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fake surveys, the selective enforcement, and the family connection to Millbrook Development Company all painted a clear picture of corruption. "I have always acted in good faith," she told the commissioners. "If there have been procedural errors, we can address them through proper channels." The crowd was not buying it. Shouts of "resign" and "arrest her" filled the room. Commissioner Johnson, who had always been one of Sheriff Karen's supporters, looked uncomfortable. "Sheriff Martinez," he said formally, "these are very serious allegations. I think it would be appropriate for you to step aside while the investigation is completed." "I will not step aside," Sheriff Karen replied. "I was elected to do a job and I intend to keep doing it." But her authority was crumbling. Half of her deputies had already requested transfers to other departments. The ones who remained were clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Deputy Martinez, who had always seemed decent, publicly announced he would cooperate fully with the state investigation. The county attorney, who had initially supported Sheriff Karen's actions, quietly withdrew all the legal filings related to property disputes. The fake surveys were removed from official records. The zoning violations and tax disputes that had been used to harass other property owners were dropped. Most importantly, a judge ordered the immediate removal of the fence blocking my access road. Sheriff Karen was required to pay for the removal personally, since it had been built on private property without authorization. I watched from my porch as the construction crew tore down the fence that had trapped me for 3 months. Each section that came down felt like a small victory, but the real victory was yet to come. Sheriff Karen resigned on a Friday afternoon in November. She released a brief statement saying she wanted to focus on her family and pursue other opportunities. But everyone knew the truth. She was facing criminal charges and had no choice but to step down. The Texas Rangers had built an airtight case against her. Fraud, extortion, abuse of office, and civil rights violations. Her brother-in-law Richard was charged as well for his role in the land-buying scheme. Millbrook Development Company was forced to sell back all the properties it had acquired at fair market value. I received a check for $47,000 as compensation for the harassment and property damage I had suffered. It covered my legal fees and gave me enough left over to make some improvements to the ranch. But the money was not the real victory. The real victory was watching the system work the way it was supposed to work. Corrupt officials were held accountable. Victims were compensated. The rule of law was restored. The new sheriff, elected in a special election, was a retired state trooper with 30 years of experience and a spotless record. One of his first acts was to establish new policies preventing conflicts of interest and requiring transparency in all property-related enforcement actions. "What happened under Sheriff Martinez will never happen again," he told the local newspaper. "Law enforcement is here to serve the community, not exploit it." The fence posts were the last thing to be removed from my access road. I kept one of them as a reminder of what had happened. It sits in my barn now, next to a framed copy of the deed that Mrs. Foster signed over to me. Margaret Foster passed away peacefully 6 months after Sheriff Karen's resignation. Her grandson told me she had followed the whole story in the news and was proud that her family's land had played a role in bringing down a corrupt official. "She always said that bullies only win when good people do nothing," he told me at her funeral. "You proved her right." These days, my ranch is peaceful again. I wake up every morning to the sound of cattle and wind through the oak trees. The gate at the end of my access road stays open now, the way it should be. Sometimes visitors ask to see where the famous fence used to be. I show them the spot and tell them the story. But mostly, I just enjoy the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice was served. The experience taught me something important about power and corruption. Bullies with badges count on people being too afraid or too overwhelmed to fight back. They use their authority to make resistance seem impossible. But power has limits. Even corrupt officials have to follow the law eventually. And sometimes, if you are patient and careful and refuse to be intimidated, you can turn their own weapons against them. Sheriff Karen learned that lesson the hard way. She built a fence to trap me, but in the end, it became the trap that caught her.